Okie dokie. So let's hop in here and get this up the full slide of the Federal Reserve System. And the links that are on here are videos that you already have access to that I have posted that go over the basics of the concepts that we went over in class. So just as a quick sort of recap, money is anything of value that supports an economy. Currency is the way that you buy and sell things. So when we're talking about money, there's what's called hard money. Or sometimes referred to as commodity money. That is a physical, tangible product that has value to it. For example, gold, silver, lithium, platinum, at one time salt. These were things that people valued and they placed value on, and they were recognized as being something that you could form trade based on. Soft money is paper that represents the actual hard money. So it represents whatever commodity that you're basing your economy on. Fiat money is money that has value because the government tells you it has value and you are forced to use it. There is no commodity or hard product backing that money up. So a great example of fiat money that all of you are familiar with is the peso. Okay, you must use the peso for BAME. There is nothing backing the peso up. There is nothing giving the peso value other than the fact that we tell you that you must use it and the peso has value. So that's what you have to do. The US dollar is another example of fiat money, as are actually most world currencies. So let's talk about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 by the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law by Woodrow Wilson. Now, the actual origin of the Federal Reserve is much older than the 1913 passage, and it's actually even predates the men who were responsible for the initial or the initial bill. I think that was the Glass-Steagall bill or something. In 1910, a group of 6 bankers representing the major banks of the United States and Europe to some degree, and the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and a senator from Rhode Island all met on an island estate owned by J.P. Morgan, and for 9 days outlined what would become the Federal Reserve System. And it is sometimes referred to as the creature of Jekyll Island, which is where the meeting took place, Jekyll Island, Georgia. It was secret. The people who worked for J.P. Morgan had no idea who their 8 guests were. The guests all went under aliases or assumed names so that people wouldn't know who they were, where they were going, or what they were doing. And they decided to create a private banking system that would be set up to run the nation's economy and stabilize the finances of America. The reason why I'm bringing this up specifically is because if you remember, one of the reasons why Woodrow Wilson got the Democratic nomination was he promised William Jennings Bryan the creation of a national bank, but he promised the creation of a public bank. What he signed into law is a private bank. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a moment. And please, if you have not done so, which you should have because it was homework, go back and watch the video that explains the entire nature of how the private banking system in America works. It's kind of an interesting deep dive into the way that central banking is set up. So what the Federal Reserve does, in a very simple way, The Federal Reserve divides the country up into 12 districts, like the Hunger Games. There are 12 district banks. All the banks are theoretically equal, although the main bank is the Bank of New York. These are all private banks. They are each overseen by a president of the bank. The Federal Reserve has a board of directors made up of 7 members who are appointed directly by the president and confirmed by the Senate. These 7 people serve a 14-year term. Now, the terms cannot be renewed immediately, but they can eventually come back up and serve again if they are so nominated. So they essentially keep working for the bank that they are a member of, as well as being a member of this board of directors. One of those members of the board of directors is the chairman of the board. He serves a 4-year term as chairman and can be re-nominated as chairman as many times as the president wants. So this is a workaround on the 14-year term limit. The chairman can serve as many times as he or she wants to that they're nominated for it. 5 members of the Federal Reserve banks, so 5 presidents of the banks, and the 7 members of the board of directors serve as what's called the Open Market Committee. They are the people who monitor the economy and keep track of what's going on. So, move this up here because it's getting in my way. What exactly does the Fed do? The Fed is a bank. It's a private bank, but it's not a bank that anybody can just walk into and like open up an account. It's a bank for other banks. It monitors banks and makes sure that they have money. When a bank issues a loan, they run, like, especially if it's a big loan, they go through the Federal Reserve Bank that is for their district. So like in Milwaukee, they would go through the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. If they need money, they borrow money from the Federal Reserve, and they have to pay it back just like any of us do for a bank loan. The fact that they pay it back means that they charge a higher rate of interest to borrowers so that they can pay back the interest rate that they need to the Federal Reserve. The Fed does 2 specific things in order to control monetary policy. Monetary policy is how money functions in a society. The 2 things are increasing or decreasing the amount of money in use and setting interest rates. And there's an inverse relationship here, okay? If they want people to spend money. So let's just look at right now. The economy is kind of in bad shape. When you're paying $6 a dozen for eggs, that's a little rough. What the Fed will generally do in times like this is to stimulate or push the economy to grow by putting more money into use, or that's called circulation. At the same time, they will lower the interest rates to encourage people to borrow money and to spend that money to stimulate the economy to grow and get bigger. When there are areas of the economy that are going cray-cray, like housing costs, for example, right now, the Fed will actually raise the interest rates to discourage people from spending money, for lack of a better term, stupid. So, to stimulate the economy, they increase the amount of money available. The amount of money available goes up, interest rates go down. To slow down the economy, or they're concerned that people are spending money stupid, they reduce the amount of money available, and they raise interest rates. Interest rates go up to stimulate, they go down to slow down. Interest is simply the price of borrowing money, whether that's a bank borrowing money from the Fed or us borrowing money from a bank. Now, as far as the money supply goes, The Federal Reserve actually sells money to the United States government. If you look at money, like if you have money in your pocket, any size bill, you will see that it says on there Federal Reserve Note. That is because the United States government does not own the money. It buys the money and to use from the Fed. The Fed will not take its own money as payment, by the way. They demand government bonds. Those bonds increase the profits of the Federal Reserve because the Fed receives interest from them. Those bonds are basically IOUs or debts that the government takes on to pay the Fed, increasing the size of the national debt. Most of the $36 trillion or thereabouts that the U.S. government has in the national debt is money that we actually owe to the Federal Reserve in the form of bond payment. Because the Federal Reserve is independent, it makes a profit every year. And like any private corporation, there are shareholders. In this case, the banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System, which is pretty much every bank in the country, gets bonuses with the more money that the Fed makes. And those bonuses take the form of extra payments to bank employees, specifically bank managers and like presidents, as well as it getting into the hands of the bankers, like general bank employees. Now, what else the Fed does? It pays off U.S. debts. If the U.S. owes money to a foreign country or to a state, the Fed oversees the payment of those debts. Those payments and the overseeing of the regular installs of those payments are what establishes the credit rating for the United States. Credit rating is how dependable you are to pay back a debt. The Fed also regulates debts between states. So like if Illinois owes Wisconsin money or vice versa, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago would oversee those payments between the two states. The Fed watches out for risks in the economy. Are people spending money stupid? Are houses way overvalued, which they are right now? Are cars overvalued, which they are right now? The Fed watches that and it monitors the amount of money being taken out in the form of loans to purchase those things. And if it becomes a question of, is this really safe or good? The Fed will intervene to restructure interest rates, reduce or take money out of the supply in the government, and generally try to oversee the economy. And the Fed is also there to make sure that when you go to the bank, you actually have money in the bank. If you need to go get money out of the bank for something, the Fed is there to make sure that you have the cash available. Now, if you want to take a large sum of cash out of the bank, they don't have that money sitting there. Legally, they are allowed to wait a certain period of time. They can also issue you a cashier's check, and they can also actually require you to fill out paperwork explaining why you need money. Now, the Fed is completely self-funded. The only aspect of the Federal Reserve that is actually federal, as in part of the government, is the 7 board of director members, who, by the way, cannot be removed except for major criminal activity, voluntary retirement, or death during their time in office. The Fed is self-funded, so all of the loans that it makes and all of the sales that it makes in the form of ordering the government to buy money is how it makes a profit. And by the way, the Fed can actually order the government to buy money. And if the government wants money, it must ask permission before it actually starts that up, because the Fed sells the government the paper and the ink that the government uses to print the money. It must issue a report each year of how it uses money. Now, that report, however, does not have to be overly detailed. If you remember one of the videos, at the time, Chairman Benjamin Bernanke refused to answer direct questions from Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders regarding specifically where money went to. And the Fed actually has no responsibility to do so. There is no agency of government that can actually control or check how the Federal Reserve functions. They are completely 100% independent. theoretically, the ability to control the board of directors and the chairman of the board is how the Fed is controlled. But realize that many secretaries of the Treasury are actually members of the Federal Reserve System, and it's in their interest to keep the Fed functioning the way they want to because of the profits that the Fed makes and the dividends that the Fed pays out. Secondly, there's a distinct lack of transparency. It's all very fuzzy, okay? If you are audited by the IRS, you must fully disclose how you got money and how you spent money and everything else. The Fed doesn't have to do that. Now, to be fair, nobody's actually tried auditing the Fed yet, but that's how that goes. There's also a remarkable lack of success in stabilizing the economy. Under the Fed's watch, we had the Great Depression. We had stagflation, which is a theoretical concept that can't exist. That's when you have inflation when there's a lack of money. How you can have prices go up when nobody's got any money is a little bit weird to me, but that's what happens when you try to control artificially how things work, and then supply and demand kick in as well. The housing crash of 2010 was under the Fed's watch. And the Fed is making an already terrifyingly gigantic debt get bigger. And if the Fed ever got really schnorky, that's a word that means, jerky, they could call the debt due, and that would make a big problem for the United States government. Not that they would, because it's in their interest not to, but they could theoretically. The Federal Reserve is an interesting example of what happens when you have essentially crony capitalism, where a select group of people are given special favors, and they then create a monopoly. And that's what the Fed is. Okay, if you have any questions, you can always ask in class. You can go back and watch the old videos that I posted and look at your notes. Peace and love.